Okay, 1:20, the inquiry is now resumed. Before we go back to the third parties, just a couple of procedural issues, and I'll let Ms. Searson deal with those.
Yes, we've had correspondence this morning from Mr. Osborne. Can I just confirm with Mr. Morehouse? So Mr. Osborne was one of your witnesses. Are you now not?
Yes, he following the discussion about the evidence, the recordings, I think he has asked to effectively act on his own behalf.
Okay.
And hence the representations. I think I'm certainly not aware of what he's submitted to you.
Okay, well, I'll go through this now, but I just wanted to clarify that he's no longer part of the PCAA, just from your perspective as well. So we've had a request from Mr. Osborne to use his witness statement that was submitted as a proof as part of the PCAA, but as an interested person. And he has also requested to now submit a report as late evidence. He was due to appear in person tomorrow. In terms of the late evidence, we've been provided with an executive summary only, and it appears to be a report by an expert commissioned by Mr. Osborne to record noise levels at his property, and it's a report in relation to that. I don't have a reason as to why this is late, and it is, I mean, obviously Mr. Osborne isn't with us today, but it is frustrating to have only just been made aware of this now. I know we had the separate request for the noise recording, and none of this is normal inquiry procedure. In terms of the report, Mr. Humphreys, did you have any initial thoughts as to the acceptability of this at this stage, obviously without having had the benefit of hearing from Mr. Osborne on it himself?
No, madam, it's a matter entirely for you as the inspectors. It seems to me that a report, a written document that sets out reasons, is different from a recording that is played. I have no, in principle, objection to you having that. It's entirely a matter for you. It is late, and that is unfortunate. And if it's going to be submitted, then I suppose it makes sense that it is done sooner rather than later, so that, you know, if my witness, Mr. Williams, wants to comment on it, that he can. I think my concern was simply with, you know, the complications around playing a recording of something which I understood was outside, playing that recording inside, which has a different sort of acoustic to it. But you know, with this sort of thing, I very much leave it to the three of you, if I may say so. Okay.
Well, there's two things here. So in respect of the noise recording, that request has also been put to us again today. We have a few more details of what this is, but not many. And there are technological requests that go with that in terms of calibration and use of projector, which I'm not even sure if we can do.
And as I say, it would need to be done outside.
Yes, and obviously, you know, your noise witness, and indeed the council's noise witness, isn't here to oversee any of this as well, if indeed we could do that. So, I mean, we've discussed this over lunch. Our thoughts are still no in terms of the recording, because personally we don't think it'll be that helpful to us. In terms of the report, and I presume, and again, it's difficult without Mr. Osborne being here himself to probe a little bit, but we presume the recording and the report go hand in hand together. So we have written evidence. You know, the report will underpin the recording. So, you know, although it's late, I think we are minded to accept this as an exception at this stage. As Mr. Osborne is due to be heard tomorrow, if we can get that as soon as possible, you may have questions for him tomorrow, but if you're able to read and digest that, I don't know about the timings. There obviously is a later maybe September session for local interested parties, which he could come, and that might give you more time. But I don't know how
Yes.
you feel about that. So.
Madam, if it's, in a sense it depends what it is. If it is a recording or a report that shows a recording, you know, it will have an LMAX, it will have an LAQ over whatever time period it's been taken. I assume it's been done properly. I'll have no particular reason to believe that if it has been done properly, it's not correct and accurate. It will be a series of numbers. I don't think I will have any questions, but it's difficult to know that without having seen it. But
Yeah.
you know, that's kind of really all I can say at this stage. But you know, if clearly if Mr. Osborne's going to be come along tomorrow, and I'm completely relaxed about that, then you know, it would help if I could have it today, you know, late, you know, at the end of the session, so I can just have a look at it and ask the appropriate people whether I need to ask anything. But I don't anticipate that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Mr. Henderson, I know you are calling a noise witness. I know you're not it's slightly different from your perspective, but did you have any comments at this stage?
Well, I don't have anything to add to what Mr. Humphries has already said.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll, Ms. Vincent, if you can contact Mr. Osborne and ask for the report, and we'll try as soon as possible. We'll try and get that emailed around, and then no doubt we'll come back to it tomorrow in the morning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, returning that, Mr. Morehouse. Yes.
My apologies. Just as a matter of housekeeping and such, we've been told that Kathy Curling, who we had understood to be due this morning, in fact isn't able to be here today, but I think arrangements have been made for her to come tomorrow morning. So my apologies for that, but I think Ms. Vincent is aware of that and has factored that in.
Okay, tomorrow morning. Yeah, okay. Right, do we have Caroline New? Good afternoon, come forward. You don't need your mask. Straight in front of me.
Can you turn your microphone on? It's the button on the front. There's a knack, don't worry.
Aha, got it. Thank you for the chance to address this inquiry. I'm a grandmother of 3 children. I live in Bristol. My grandchildren have become increasingly anxious about climate change news. It's hard to reassure them when the people with power are not behaving as rational adults should. And I mean by that, are not applying the precautionary principle to safeguard the lives of today's children and those of generations to come. Now, most people don't realize that setting goals for carbon emissions reduction and choosing a pathway to them is rather like making a bet. You need to calculate the odds and work out whether you can afford them. It's also not generally understood, obviously I'm not referring to the people present, I'm referring to the population as a whole, that if the world does manage to reach net zero by 2050, and if the UK plays its proportionate and equitable part in this effort, we, that is humanity, are still likely to overshoot 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're already experiencing the disruptive effects of 1 degree. After 2050, we, globally, will then have to get rid of carbon through negative emissions technologies, many of which are as yet in embryo, in order to get the temperature down by 2100. Well, the IPCC report of 2018 took all this into account. It outlined and evaluated various pathways to net zero by 2050. Its slogan, in summary, was "Sooner is safer." The sooner you make radical cuts in emissions, the less the impacts and the less likelihood of dangerous overshoot. And this calculation was made back then on the basis of models which could not include the feedback effects we're already seeing, could not calculate the additional risk of triggering catastrophic runaway climate change. To quote the IPCC, no pathways achieved greater than 66% probability of limiting warming below 1.5 degrees during the entire 21st century. I would never take my family onto a plane with those sort of odds. Much has happened in the real world since the airport's application to expand was rejected by North Somerset councillors. None of it justifies the airport's extraordinary optimism. Just one of many examples, the World Meteorological Organization now says that the chance of exceeding 1.5 degrees in any 1 year has doubled from 20% to 40%. Climate scientists are said to be no longer concerned, but terrified. The various branches of UK law, I understand, have not yet been realigned to meet the government's 2050 target, and the appeal seeks to get in fast before this necessary work is done and before there's a coherent national aviation policy. Mr. Humphreys pointed out on Tuesday that the Paris Agreement has not been incorporated into UK law and is therefore not binding in the same sense. One result of that has been that the government is able to ignore its own undertaking in that agreement to consult with and work in tandem with local authorities such as North Somerset to reduce climate emissions, carbon emissions. Another example of how legal chaos has helped the airport's case, there is as yet no accepted scientific definition of the degree of danger from aircraft's non-CO2 emissions, so their likely effects could just be omitted in the airport's environmental risk assessment. This inquiry will determine whether the airport's application to expand is consonant with UK law, despite last year's democratic decision of the North Somerset Council to reject it. Expanding may arguably be in the rational economic interests of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, but that is by no means certain. There's no way it can be in the overall interests of the citizens of North Somerset, or of the UK, or of future generations all over the world. Even if it's finally decided that the airport's appeal meets current legal standards, morally it represents a cynical betrayal of the interests of children alive today and of generations to come. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Any questions? No. Thank you, Ms. New. Will you just make sure that you email a copy of your speaking notes? Thank you. Okay, next I have Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Dave Mitchell on behalf of Christian Climate Action. No, not at the moment. Mr. Roger Sirrett. No. Yeah, the lady there. I want to see what Joe's got to say. Yeah. I think it's probably easier you come forward rather than me going through the names.
So just while the lady's sitting down, I was trying to tick things off this morning, and I didn't tick off, and I don't think it was called David Searby. I may have completely missed it, but it was one of the names. You did?
We did.
Did
yes.
And attended, and I just haven't ticked it off? Or?
He did, yes.
Perfect. I'm so sorry, sir. I was just trying to make sure that everyone had been called. And
I think he was the first one that spoke after the PCA witnesses. I think he was a quite tall,
yes, I remember.
very clearly spoken gentleman.
I remember now. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Harland, and I'm speaking on behalf of Backwell Residents Association, abbreviated to BRA, a membership organisation representing over 400 paid-up households with 700 members in the parish of Backwell. BRA seeks to safeguard and promote the collective interests of Backwell residents in matters concerning social, economic and community life and the character of the village. Bristol Airport is adjacent to Backwell boundaries and directly affects the residents, particularly those living in the downside area of the parish. In December 2019, BRA members gave the mandate to object to the expansion of Bristol Airport planning application 18P 5118 OUT. And whilst recognising the convenience of a regional airport and its contribution to the economy, BRA is seriously concerned about several adverse factors which will be exacerbated by further expansion. We fully support the position of North Somerset Council's decision to refuse expansion. An additional 2 million passengers per annum would not be in the best interests of residents' health and well-being, and contrary to the policies CS3, CS23, CS26 of the North Somerset Core Strategy 2017. After the global pandemic, which has devastated the aviation industry, with recovery at best projected towards the end of 2022 to 23, we believe this application is untimely and inappropriate when limited public resources should be better spent. The focus for Bristol Airport should be on rebuilding to 2019 levels, whilst taking a much more considered view to the green economy and the environmental impact. In terms of surface transport, the airport is in a rural greenbelt area poorly served by sustainable transport links. It generates a significant volume of road traffic. Expansion will substantially increase traffic as most passengers arrive and depart by car. Traffic is bad enough along Downside and through Downside and along Brockley Combe, but it's even worse on the narrow, inadequate lanes down to Backwell and Backwell Farley, where taxis often drive too fast and quite inconsiderately. The proposed road improvements on the A38 will do nothing to improve these current problems. Residents report having access to their homes hindered by holidaymakers obstructing their driveways to avoid airport parking, taxis outside their house or in gateways waiting for flights to land, increased litter, deep sleep disturbance at night as people return to their parked vehicles in residential areas. Investment in mass transit systems seems unaffordable and unrealistic in the foreseeable future. So we thank you to the appeal inspectors for agreeing to visit our narrow lanes. In terms of aircraft noise, quieter engines might well be helping over time, but aircraft noise is already intrusive in our parish, particularly at Downside. Our members complain about aircraft noise when they're out enjoying open spaces, including areas some distance away, such as Cadbury Hill and Clevedon. Low-flying helicopters and transport planes are also a noise nuisance. More and/or larger aircraft will generate more noise overall, even with quieter engines. Night flying is a disturbance to residents, particularly during the summer, and shouldn't be allowed at this airport. Air pollution. We're all increasingly aware of air pollution and global warming, and it is widely acknowledged that air travel is a major contributor to climate change. Residents report a strong smell of kerosene in the air. Greenbelt encroachment. Bristol Airport's excessive use of permitted development applications is of concern, with a number of new developments encroaching into Greenbelt that have had a serious impact on wildlife, which requires protection. So in conclusion, BRA acknowledges the benefits to the local economy and convenience to local users, but these advantages are not sufficient to justify further expansion. Indeed, Bristol Airport overstates the economic benefits to the region, as traffic is comprised principally of outbound tourism. Also, that the airport are trying to attract business away from Cardiff and Exeter airports, which would generate longer surface journeys from those areas. The airport should not be allowed to cause any additional intrusion into the green belt. To increase beyond the current 10 million passengers per annum is unsustainable and certainly outweighs the advantages. The airport is seriously constrained by its location, its topography, poor transport infrastructure, and Bristol Airport claims to be close to achieving carbon neutral status. However, airport carbon emissions and associated passenger journeys are omitted from their calculations. Air travel cannot be allowed to continue unchecked, and the time has come to call to a halt to further expansion. BRA calls upon the inspectors to uphold North Somerset's decision to refuse planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you just ensure the Cape Programme Officer has a copy of your speaking notes?
Already done. Thank you very
All right.
much.
You are good. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Ireland. Okay. I'll deal with it, gentlemen. Does the gentleman at the back wish to speak as well? You're together. Okay. We've got Mr. Workers here. Yeah. Right, we'll go to David Worsgett then. I can see you, Mr. Worsgett, in front of me. You represent CPRE, is that correct? Just unmute your microphone.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Sorry, I've only just logged in. It was like you started early after lunch, so I was slightly taken by surprise. Okay. Well, look, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to make a short statement. Let me just first say that I'm absolutely not going to repeat points we've made in any of our earlier CPRE submissions. I know you'll have looked at those carefully, and I think if I repeat them, it just annoys you and wastes time. So I'm actually going to try to add, not to duplicate. CPRE is the oldest countryside charity in England. Our core object is to protect the countryside. That remit in the modern world includes doing so not only for the sake of the countryside itself, but because it's important for the health, mental health and welfare the countryside brings to people from all backgrounds, and because of the countryside's key role in helping address climate change. I'm speaking to you in my capacity as the chair of the CPRE Avon and Bristol charity, which is one of the independent charities within the CPRE network. And so, my focus is very much on this region, but we are part of the broader network, and therefore we have the expertise and knowledge of the countrywide network behind us. I just want to make that clear. I'm just really going to try to make three what I hope are fairly simple additional points this afternoon. But first, given what we now know about the speed and the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change, there really can be no excuse for the government not including aviation fully in its various plans to mitigate the problems. The amount of flying quite simply has to reduce, not increase. And I hear the talk about hopes for non-polluting aircraft and reliance on offsetting schemes, but I have to say there are few guarantees of delivery or the timescale for delivery. They may deliver some results one day, but that one day is a long way off, and hopes do not constitute guarantees. So until we do have guarantees, I think we have to act on the precautionary principle that they may not deliver what is claimed for them. Expansion of Bristol Airport would run directly contrary to that precautionary principle, and indeed to the climate change and environmental policies of the nearby local authorities and of national government. To allow expansion on the eve of the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, in which the UK wishes to play a leading role, would make a complete nonsense of what are now claimed to be policy priorities. So second, I would invite the inspectors to take note of the huge concerns about the effects on the wider region and that those sometimes get slightly downplayed. The traffic effects will be widespread and will be over and above the frankly unmanageable impact on the road system immediately serving the airport. Promoters know that most airport traffic will be cars. Just look at the scale of the car parking proposals. They also know that there are virtually no significant road improvements capable of being delivered which will cope with that demand, even if that were an acceptable approach, which it isn't. The new mayor for the West of England has made it clear, for example, that he will not support the building of the new South Bristol Ring Road through Whitchurch, which was actually one of the key schemes in the now defunct joint local transport plan, on which the airport promoters were actually relying. Public and professional doubts about the wisdom of smart motorways, or so-called smart motorways, grow by the day, so the chances of Highway England being able to do what would need to be done for the capacity of the wider motorway network reduce all of the time. However, look, this is not just about traffic congestion and noise and pollution from cars. We also have to recognise that any increase in the number of flights has a very damaging effect on the tranquility of the countryside across the wide area. And all night flights, of course, upset the delicate equilibrium on which ecosystems depend. And we're only just starting to understand how important those ecosystems are. So it's essential that those factors are fully recognised, taken into account, and that the expansion is not allowed to go ahead because of them. Now, finally, let me say something about the economic case and the best interests of business. Earlier work commissioned by CPRE, and I have to say not effectively refuted by the promoters, demonstrated that the claimed economic benefits were massively overstated. They were also in part based on the concept of robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking activity away from other regional airports. Now, given that this is a wealthy region, this is surely hardly a good way to level up. I mean, CPRE is not hostile to business. I most certainly am not. I spent 20 years in business. But we would appeal to all of those representing business interests to recognise, and therefore for the inspectors to recognise, the time has indeed come to build back better, and in particular greener, and to put our investment and effort into the new industries and new technologies and new ways of working. We should not be investing, even from a business point of view, in the old models that have such damaging effects on both our environment, on our health, our welfare, and indeed ultimately on our economy, when in due course we would have to pay for the consequences. And really, I don't want to take any more of your time than that. Those are the points I want to make today, and I hope those are helpful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Is your signal frozen? No. You were very still. I thought your signal had just broken up.
No, I'm still here. I'm still moving, I'm glad to say.
Okay, any questions? No.
Well, sir,
yes.
no thank you. No questions from me either. Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Just can you again ensure that you send in your speaking notes to the programme officer?
I will do that straight away. Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we know who's coming at the back? Yeah. The gentleman at the back that's just walked in, are you here to speak? You just here to observe? Yes, okay. Okay, we have Miss Walkden joining us virtually. Is it? Miss Walkden, are you there? I can see JW.
Hello?
Good
Hello.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. So I'm here speaking for myself, but I'm also a
Sorry
member
to interrupt.
sorry.
Mr. Yeah, so we just want one of the cameras off, so thank you. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm speaking for myself, but also I'm also a member of Bristol Friends of the Earth, who have opposed the airport expansion. I'd like to follow on from some of the points which were made this morning about whether this is a local, national or even international issue. The government, as people have said, has committed to the to the Paris Agreement, and while it hasn't been enshrined in law, the government this year pledged to enshrine a law with a 78 reduction target, a target of reducing emissions by 78% by 2035. So that's a national commitment within which all local projects, particularly those with significant carbon loads, must fit. Since last submitting a statement at the beginning of the year, Stansted, Southampton and Leeds airports have been given the green light. So given the 78% reduction target, any decision on Bristol has to take into consideration the additional tonnes, millions of tonnes, that these three airports are now permitted to emit. And we have to ask how the rest of the economy is going to function if airports and aeroplanes are being allowed to increase on this scale. Where is that 78% reduction going to come from in not many years? And while it could be said that one airport's increased emissions could be accommodated, it's another thing to allow this ad hoc incremental expansion, and it's difficult to see how it fits the criterion of sustainable development, even if you try to limit the definition of this phrase. And there's another aspect to this. Dave Lee, the CEO of Bristol Airport, has recently pointed out that passenger numbers have declined and will take several years to recover following the COVID pandemic. This means that the expansion of the airport's infrastructure could lead to overcapacity, particularly when added to the expansion ambitions of other airports, both those already granted and those in the application stage. So dedicating resources, including manpower in this post-Brexit world where we have manpower restrictions, to something that may be surplus to requirement means that other projects are going to find it difficult to get the go-ahead or to go ahead. At the same time, the airports may not achieve their objectives. This, in combination with increased noise, congestion, the effects on health, may mean that the airport becomes a huge drain on the region, not an asset. I'd like to add that while climate change and CO2 levels seem remote and intangible, they're having a real effect. April this year saw global temperatures 1.4% higher than baseline. For 2 years in a row, we've seen record temperatures at high latitudes. Siberia has had huge fires 2 years in a row, and Canada and the US have broken heat records. The US is now covered in smog as a consequence of forest fires. While for the last 2 months, countries across the Middle East have been fighting to adapt to temperatures reaching almost 50 degrees C. We're already at 419 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Scientists previously thought 450 parts per million was the limit. But from where we are now, in terms of extreme climate events, it's difficult to see how the planet can sustain an extra 30 parts per million. If there is an increase, the frequency of these heat events will increase pressure on governments to reduce emissions more quickly, and maybe even more quickly than 75% by 2035. This could lead to what Mark Carney calls stranded assets. That is, businesses that are forced to close because they're too damaging. In light of this, putting all our carbon eggs into airports looks very short-sighted, bad for the climate, bad for the economy, and bad for investors. We have to get away from looking at one development at a time and from the point of view of short-term local economic advantage. We're intelligent beings. We should be able to do the maths. We have to start recognising that that the consequences of our actions are much wider. They involve human health, the ability to sustain food production, loss of coastal settlements, and so on and so on. They will last for well over 100 years, much longer if we're reckless, and they will cost billions of pounds to mitigate. We should not be jeopardising the next generation's prospects for short-term gain. That's not sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walkden. Can you make sure you email a copy of your speaking notes into the programme officer, please?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Mr.
So
Humphrey,
could I just, I don't want to ask a question, but I just want to clarify something that 2 or 3 people have referred to about the Paris Agreement and it not being incorporated. What I said yesterday in paragraph 2, on Tuesday 208 in the opening is that the Paris Agreement is an unincorporated agreement, not incorporated into UK law directly. A contrast to that would be something like the United Nations European Convention on Human Rights, which in the Human Rights Act 1998 is directly incorporated. That's why we talk about, you'll have heard it in planning advice, Article 6 rights. Why Article 6? Because the schedule to the Human Rights Act is the European Convention. It has been directly incorporated. The point I was making about the Paris Agreement is that the UK has taken its commitment, and that's enshrined in the Climate Change Act. So it's not as though the government has just sort of denied all this and moved away. It's reflected in the Climate Change Act rather than the convention being directly incorporated. No criticism, obviously, of Mr. Walkden at all or any others, but just so that there isn't some sort of misunderstanding. I made that point in paragraph 211 of the opening.
thank you. Do we have anybody at the back of the room? I can see we have Mr. Lax virtually, but I'm just going to, before I come to Mr. Lax, is there anybody that's come in at the back of the room that's here to speak? Yep, does one of you want to come forward? Yeah, Miss Walkden, Mr. Lax, will you just turn your screens off? I'll come back to you, Mr. Lax, shortly, okay? Just turn your camera off, Miss Walkden. There we go. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Do I press?
It's already on.
It's already on?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Breda Kingston. I live in Bath. I'm a retired NHS consultant psychologist and a current member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. I'm also involved with Bath Extinction Rebellion Group. But I'm speaking to you today primarily as a grandmother. I have, by the way, sent a copy of what I'm saying electronically, so it should be available. I trust it is. I feel distress and grief in my relationship with my children and grandchildren about the future they will have as a result of the climate and biodiversity crisis that is upon us. No doubt many, if not all of you, feel similarly about yours and future generations. We now know from numerous recent scientific sources that the threat is even greater and more urgent than predicted. There is already irremediable damage in many parts of the world, and the window for possible action that might help to avert the most catastrophic and widespread effects is closing. Sir David King, formerly Chief Government Scientific Advisor, set up the Climate Crisis Advisory Group with 14 international scientists last month. In the report that accompanied the launch, they said, I quote, "Globally, we will need to reduce our carbon emissions deeply and rapidly, a reduction that will require fundamental change by governments, businesses, individuals, and civil society. Current targets are not enough. Nations need to triple their emission-cutting pledges to limit the Earth's warming. 2050 is no longer enough to halt the irreversible and long-term impacts and the climate crisis, the impacts of the climate crisis, and it is essential to consider aiming to reach carbon net zero by 2035 to 2040. End of quote. In spite of being in the midst of an unprecedented climate and biodiversity crisis brought about by humankind's carbon emissions, and knowing the urgent action that is needed by all of us, Bristol Airport's owners, the huge investment group called Ontario Teachers Pension Plan Fund, with $221.2 billion in net assets, somehow feels that they should be an exception. They feel entitled to appeal against a democratically made decision to refuse their expansion plans, and they are demanding that they be allowed to emit even more carbon than they currently do. In her recently published and widely acclaimed book, Sally Weintraub, a psychoanalyst and fellow of the Institute of Psychoanalysis, explores this kind of exceptionalism and entitlement that she sees as being at the heart of a neoliberal culture of uncare and at the root of the climate crisis. An entitlement that does not take account of the injustices in the climate crisis, including the injustice in the impact on future generations. Dr. James Dyke from the Global Systems Institute at Exeter University, in arguing passionately against intergenerational injustice in carbon emissions, cites Bristol Airport's claim to become net zero without counting the flights as an example of such injustice. Bristol Airport no doubt sees that there is no valid argument against the need to reduce emissions, hence the energy they put into greenwashing, which is, of course, the process of providing misleading information in an attempt to appear environmentally sound. No amount of greenwashing can make the business of an airport carbon neutral, and no amount of wishful thinking can bring about alternative, sustainable aviation fuels at scale and in time. To return to the impact on children now and in the future, several mental health studies have found that there is widespread distress and anxiety about the climate crisis amongst children. Anxiety as a response to the climate and ecological crisis is rational and alerts us to danger. But danger requires safeguarding action, and particularly so for children. They need our support. Their anxiety is much increased and can feel overwhelming when those who have the responsibility, power, and authority to intervene to reduce the danger do not do so. Failing collectively to do all that we can to reduce our emissions as rapidly as possible leaves me feeling both heartbroken and furious about the preventable peril that they are facing. We expect parents and grandparents to protect children's well-being. We would be shocked to see a parent or grandparent greedily feed themselves far more than they needed and go on asking for more, and in so doing cause damage and deplete resources so that there was nothing left for their children and grandchildren. That is what the owners of Bristol Airport's plan represents. The European Union Climate Policy Chief, Frans Timmermans, told a news conference last week, I quote, "If we renounce our obligation to help humanity live within planetary boundaries, we would fail not just ourselves, but we would fail our children and our grandchildren. The price of failure," he said, "was that they would be," and I quote, "fighting wars over water and food," close quotes. If permission was given to expand the airport, it would send a clear message to our children and grandchildren that our generation is prepared to put short-term financial gain and short-term gratification before our efforts to reduce emissions, to attempt to make life sustainable on the earth that they will inhabit, a finite earth currently being destroyed by the notion of infinite economic growth. Bristol Airport's owners have not respected the democratic decision reached by North Somerset councillors and supported by the vast majority of the local population opposed to expansion. I do not expect them to listen to me, but I do expect our planning inspectors to listen. I expect them to see through the greenwash, and I expect them to exercise their responsibility and authority on behalf of our children, grandchildren, and future generations. The North Somerset councillors were on the right side of history, and I thank them for that. I appeal to this inspectorate also to be on the right side of history. The urgency is even greater now. The refusal must stand. This egregious plan to expand the airport must be stopped.
Thank you, Ms. Kingston. Have you emailed a copy of your notes?
I have.
I'm grateful. Okay. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any questions. Do we have Ms. Poole? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Okay, thank you. I'd like to briefly introduce myself and say why I've requested to speak against the expansion of Bristol Airport. I'm 57 years old, I live in Bath, and I have a daughter aged 24 living in Bristol. I've been aware of the dangers of global warming, as it used to be called, and of the need for sustainability in the way that we live since my daughter was born. But I was busy as a new working parent, and I thought that governments, including our own, would have the situation covered and would take the right steps to address the approaching danger. So I stopped worrying mostly and got on with my life, taking the occasional holiday abroad, driving when I wanted to, living according to my financial means, not the health and sustainability of the planet. 25 years later, and we know that governments, including our own, have failed to take action at anything like the scale or speed necessary. The 2018 IPCC report flagging up just how little time is left to have any chance of keeping the rise in temperatures to a level at which the worst consequences of climate change can possibly be avoided. Scientists and commentators such as David Attenborough have continued to raise their voices with thousands of ordinary people to demand urgent and immediate action in response to the science. Indeed, many scientists, including Sir David King, previously just mentioned now, have said there's even less time to make the drastic changes needed to cut carbon emissions. He has said, what we do in the next 5 years will determine the future of humanity for the next millennium. This is why I've wanted to speak at this inquiry. Bristol Airport's expansion, if permitted, will allow an additional 23,800 flights, an estimated 10,000 car movements a day, and an additional 1 million tonnes of carbon emissions a year. All this takes us further from meeting our legal obligations under the Paris Agreement, further away from meeting the UK government's Climate Change Act, and further from the government's commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. In addition to legal obligations and commitments, the UK government declared a climate emergency in May 2019, following on from the declarations in North Somerset in February that year, Bath and North East Somerset, my own council area, in March, and Bristol City Council earlier on in November 2018. In other emergency situations throughout history, actions have been taken with urgency and commitment. Going right back to the Great Fire of London, people's houses were torn down to create fire breaks. In World War II, blackout rules, rationing and conscription. Currently, as we still deal with the COVID pandemic across the world, science and scientists have been given a leading role, with governments listening to and acting on their advice. In the UK, as elsewhere, this has led to many of the usual rules, regulations and habits by which we live being overturned because the need to follow the science was recognised. The climate emergency needs to be given the same and greater weight right now, and the science on climate change be afforded the appropriate emergency response in all our decision-making. Every fraction of a degree of heating that can be prevented is essential. So when North Somerset Council considered Bristol Airport's application to expand and increase capacity, and knowing that this would generate very significant additional carbon emissions from their flights, they considered the climate emergency to be a relevant factor. In order to act in line with their declaration of a climate emergency, as well as taking other considerations into account, they rejected the application. Now this inquiry is charged with considering the airport's appeal. My question and challenge is whether this inquiry will act in line both with the legal obligations in relation to climate change and the reality of the climate emergency, as did the democratically elected councillors of North Somerset Council when they rejected the airport's application. Will this inquiry consider the lives of all our children and grandchildren who will be seriously impacted by climate change if it is not urgently addressed, and the lives of people living now in the vulnerable parts of the global south? Will this inquiry listen to the scientists who have warned that the extreme weather events just seen in the past few weeks in Canada, the US, in Germany, and now in China, that they are a direct result of climate change and will only grow in frequency and extent if the emergency is not dealt with and acted upon as an emergency and carbon emissions drastically cut from present levels? This is not a theoretical future concern which can continue to be ignored in favour of the normal rules of business as usual. To grant the airport their expansion request would not only lead to increasing carbon emissions at the exact time we need to cut them as far and as fast as we can, it would also send a message that the old business as usual is fine. This is confusing for people. On the one hand, news media is increasingly reporting the unfolding climate crisis. And on the other hand, private corporations, government and its agencies are still in many cases taking climate-wrecking decisions. If the UK allows airport expansion, then what message is this sending to those people already suffering the devastating impacts of climate change? What message does it send about UK leadership on climate action when COP26 is due to take place in Glasgow this November? In an emergency, you have to act differently, with speed, in line with the science, as with COVID, not by the rules made before the emergency was declared, and especially not when the impacts of the emergency have already resulted in thousands of deaths. My plea is that this inquiry itself acts in line with the climate emergency and rejects the expansion of Bristol Airport. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Poole. Have you sent your speaking notes in?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Mr. Lax. Yeah. Mr. Lax, are you still with us? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. My name is Ollie Lax. I'm a manufacturing engineer based in Bristol. I'll just start my statement. Last month, Bristol Airport announced they were bringing forward their plans to be carbon neutral by the end of the year and net zero by 2030. But what does this actually mean? To find out, I looked on Bristol Airport's website and found the report Becoming a Net Zero Airport, which was released a couple of years ago. On review of the figures published on page 3, I saw that the carbon emissions are split into two categories: Scope 1 and 2, which the airport says they control, and Scope 3, which they say they only influence. By reducing the emissions in this first category, it would seem the airport can viably call themselves carbon neutral. The catch, however, is colossal. By the airport's own figures, Scope 1 and 2 only accounts for a tiny 0.7% of the total emissions, including only the airport building and on-site vehicles. This category does not account for the remaining 99% of emissions caused by the flights themselves and travel to and from the airport. At this stage, the claim of being carbon neutral by the end of the year is looking fairly inconsequential. So what of the significantly larger Scope 3 area? On further review of the airport's report, it says it will reduce the emissions from its flights mostly by carbon offsetting and from improving aviation technology. The offsetting will be done through CORSIA, an international agreement on aviation carbon offsetting. However, according to a report drawn up for the German Environmental Agency, CORSIA overstates the effect of 80% of its offsetting projects, and I'm quoting here, in the absence of robust eligibility restrictions, CORSIA will not result in significant emissions reductions beyond those that would occur without the scheme. In regard to improving aviation technology, the Committee on Climate Change assumes, and I'm quoting again here, assumes that full electric planes will not be commercialised by 2050, and it does not have a role for hydrogen turbine or hydrogen fuel cell planes by 2050 either. Therefore, the industry will have to rely on new SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, which are currently in limited use and will likely only be able to reduce flight emissions by a maximum of 50% by 2050. Therefore, the airport is depending on strategies which are going to make them fall far from net zero by 2030. I understand that these are wider problems than Bristol Airport can tackle alone, so in this regard it makes sense why it claims it can only influence reductions in this area. However, we are here today to discuss the airport's appeal to allow them to expand their capacity by 20%. The airport's influence here is clear, and it is not being used to reduce their emissions. Expansion would result in a 34% increase in flight emissions from 2019 levels, leaving their efforts to decarbonise their buildings and on-site vehicles to be frankly worthless. In fact, the only way it will serve the airport is as a greenwash marketing ploy to make them appear green exactly when they're appealing for their emissions to significantly increase. North Somerset Council rejected the expansion plans last year, partially on the basis of these increased emissions, and it is for this reason that I believe this decision must stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lax. Do you want any time? No. Can you make sure you've emailed your speaking notes in? Have you done that already?
I have done, yes. Yeah, thanks for your time.
I'm grateful. Thank you. Right, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell with us? Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell.
Good afternoon. I'll just take a quick drink if that's okay with everyone.
That's fine. I should do likewise.
Quite warm out there.
Whenever you're ready, Mr. Mitchell.
Right, thank you. My name is Dave Mitchell. I live in central Bristol, and I'm here today to represent the group Christian Climate Action, a Christian organisation that seeks to tell the truth about the climate emergency we're currently in and the many ways in which human beings are exploiting the Earth's resources to the detriment of the climate and ecology around us. We believe that human beings have a purpose, and that is to nurture and work in partnership with the Earth, and thereby benefit from its bounty and natural resources. It is not to exploit it. If we love and respect the Earth, it will feed and sustain us. And as Christians, like many other people, we also believe in climate justice, and we're painfully aware that the climate emergency impacts those parts of the world that have made the least contribution to causing it. And the wealthy minority who are mostly responsible for creating the problem are relatively unscathed by its effects. So with that in mind, we strongly object to the proposed expansion of Bristol Airport. The principal reason being the resulting increase in passengers and flights that will pass through the airport if these plans are permitted to go ahead. I understand the plans are for an extra 2 million passengers a year. I can't find an estimate of the number of extra flights that equates to, but a rough calculation would suggest at least 10,000, maybe a lot more, I don't know. The emissions from these additional flights have been estimated at almost 1 million extra tons of carbon dioxide being produced per annum. And the point is, as you've already heard, that however carbon neutral the airport itself claims to be, and I'm sure they will be using all the latest eco-friendly building materials and methods, the fact remains that the flights will increase, and the net carbon emissions will therefore go up by 1 million tons or thereabouts, a significant and potentially deadly increase. These emissions contravene a number of legal commitments made by the UK government in recent years. I'm talking in particular about the 2008 Climate Act, with its commitment to reducing to net zero carbon by 2030, and of course the 2015 UN Paris Agreement on Climate, in which similar commitments were made by the majority of countries around the world. We are being urged to reduce carbon emissions across the board, and yet Bristol Airport is clearly moving in the opposite direction. Air travel is not the way forward. In 2018, aviation accounted for a massive 2.4% of total carbon emissions worldwide. If global aviation were a country, it would rank number 6 in the world between, apparently I'm told, between Japan and Germany. The non-CO2 effects, such as the warming induced by aircraft contrails and other pollutants, bring the combined total contribution of commercial aviation to approximately 5% of the world's climate warming problem. This year, 2021, in which the United Kingdom hosted the G7 summit in June, as well as the COP26 climate talks coming up in Glasgow in November, our country must do all we can to lead the world by example and look to reduce, not increase, our carbon emissions. We have the opportunity here and now to take that important step. The decision you make about the future of Bristol Airport is highly significant and being watched by other airports around the country and indeed around the world. Regarding developments in aviation efficiency, there is the claim that aviation industry has greatly improved its fuel efficiency over recent decades and is therefore on the way to becoming a far more eco-friendly means of travel. Whilst there is indeed some truth in this, the problem is that, as we all know, at the same time, the volume of air travel has increased hugely over the same period. And in fact, we see that the net result is that overall emissions have increased by 70% over the past 15 years. The need is therefore not just to improve the efficiency of aircraft engines, but rather it is to fly less, to restrict air journeys to essential flights only, and encourage other transport options that are less harmful. Human beings simply have to learn to use alternative means of transport. On the subject of other kinds of pollution, it's clear that aviation in general, Bristol Airport in particular, has a massive impact on pollution in its various forms. Air quality around airports is affected massively, with not just planes taking off and landing, but the extra cars on the road, taking people to and from. Noise pollution, serious problem in the immediate area. And with the planned introduction of night flights that I've been told about, aircraft noise disrupts sleep, can impact children's education, and there is evidence there is a link with cardiovascular risk. airports generate water pollution due to their handling of jet fuel and de-icing chemicals, with the added risk of proximity to the drinking water reservoirs. Aviation activities emit ozone and ultrafine particles, both of which are health hazards. Piston engines used widely in general aviation, I believe, burn avgas, releasing toxic lead into the atmosphere. It's leaded fuel. It's also been argued that this expansion of the airport will bring increased prosperity to the region, more jobs, more business opportunities, etc. I find this clearly to be a false argument, in that we should rather be creating jobs in areas that reduce our carbon emissions, e.g. home insulation, renewable energy, electric vehicles, recycling, heat pumps, jobs in forestry, ocean conservation, etc. These things will work positively, not just in the area of reducing the effects of the climate emergency, but they will also create jobs and prosperity for the future. Also, nearly at the end now, regarding the use of local rather than central airports, I hear the argument put forward for expanding Bristol is that it enables people to fly from an airport close to home rather than having to drive to a central airport, e.g. Heathrow, by car, with the additional environmental cost of car use. This again is a false argument, in that we should be building better public transport infrastructure to enable those people who need to fly to travel to central airports by efficient and clean public transport. The future of the human race demands that we reduce air travel, full stop, not expand it. We have to act now to change people's attitudes and assumptions, to demonstrate new ways of living and traveling, and work together to reduce the harmful impact of fossil fuel-related activity on our planet. I therefore urge you, on behalf of Christian Climate Action, to reject the current proposal for the expansion of Bristol Airport. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Will you send your speaking notes to the programme officer? Thank you.
I'll send it right now.
Yeah. Next, we have Mr. Surratt. Good afternoon, Mr. Surratt.
Good afternoon. Just made it through the traffic and the marching people. When do you want me to start?
Yes, we're ready when you are.
Fine, thanks very much. I'm essentially speaking as a private individual, but I was also a member of Stop Bristol Airport Expansion right at the beginning of this process, and we took on the airport back in 2005, and we won every single consultation against the expansion, 2-1 against. And that needs to be remembered. It's very important, and it's sad that we find ourselves here yet again arguing the same cases in many ways. Anyway, if I may read, bear with me. My name's Roger Surratt, and I live in the village of Farnborough. Above this village, the incoming aircraft to Bristol Airport begin their descent to the airport, lining up, it would appear, on the church towers of Farnborough, Compton, Dando, Norton, Merrilywood, and all the villages to the west. When the wind direction changes, the village is under the takeoff line with engines at full power. This fact alone makes a mockery of the noise contours made in Appendix B of the original master plan, which implies that the only people who will be really affected by the aircraft noise live in Congressbury or Winford. A few miles either side of the airport, everybody else between Bath, Bristol, Keynsham, Weston-super-Mare are ignored. They don't count as far as the original master plan was concerned. I can assure the appeal committee that the constant noise of aircraft taking off and landing is totally unacceptable, especially as efforts will be made to have more and more nighttime landings. This point is greatly aggravated by the fact that when the airfield was sold by Bristol City Corporation to BIA, its managing director, Mr. Skip, who was there at the time, bought it with the full knowledge that there were to be no night flights at all. That has changed, obviously, and he has plans to increase them hugely. In the early noughties, I was part of a very effective Stop Bristol Airport expansion group, and the group had few resources other than a determination that the airport should not be allowed to expand. And we took on Mr. Skip and his team with all their financial resources and access to the media, and every consultation document that the BIA put out was defeated by a majority of 2-1 against the expansion of the airport. And I hope people will bear that very much in mind when they're considering what to do after this exercise. With the success of the BIA consultation defeats, residents between Bath and Weston-super-Mare should have been affected by aircraft noise and the pollution and the general impact on a wonderful part of the Somerset countryside should have had their stated views granted. They were not. They won everything with no resources at all, and yet they were ultimately defeated, as I will point out. This point is enhanced by the fabulous rolling hills and sites of special scientific interest adjacent to Lulls Gate, where the airport has expanded onto what was once greenbelt land. This was made many times worse by the fact that an immediate solution to the larger Bristol Airport was ready and it was available at Filton and Patchway on the motorway hub of the M4 and M5 and trains from Bristol Temple Meads to all parts of Britain. As it now is, the airport has extremely poor links with the cities of the area, certainly no trains, and buses are relied on, further clogging the roadways to all the towns and cities. An important point worth making is, until recently, the last aircraft into the airport is the one carrying the Bristol Post, and that has to be offloaded and taken to Filton by lorry in the night because the sorting office was sited on the old Bristol Airport, thinking quite logically that that was where the larger Bristol Airport would be sited. How wrong they were. So where has this original decision to expand Bristol Airport gone badly wrong? And why the desire to increase its flying population from 11 million to 20 million? It's crazy. Initial responses to the airport expansion consultation only had 10% support. 10% support. There was no serious backing of the idea. 50% voted against, and their views were expressed very liberally as saying that Lulls Gate was totally unsuitable as Bristol's airport. The criteria hasn't changed, only the sprawl of the airport lit up at night in the area of outstanding natural beauty and the smell of kerosene permeating this beautiful area. Why was this plan allowed to proceed? Assurances were offered by BIA that the economy of the area would benefit, as the previous speaker said. In actual fact, most passengers, about 80% of them, are going off on holiday, and they've got their money tightly put away in their pockets, and they spend it in Europe, not Lulls Gate. Locally, a few properties have benefited from the B&B accommodation that they provide, but that's only provided really because to stay in the hotels in the airport is hugely expensive there. And people are deterred from doing it as they are deterred from parking their cars in the airport, which are sprawled out on either side to make more parking space. Too expensive. so the area continues to suffer there. Access to the airport always was and still is extremely poor. It was originally an airport for limited usage and private aircraft. All the targets suggested by BIA simply to improve access have not come to fruition. Apart from buses, one from Bath to Lulsgate via Bristol and the other to Weston-super-Mare, there is no other public transport to speak of. And that's after 20 years of development, and the people have just had to put up with this shambles. It really is a shambles. The result is they're now building double-decker parking lots and expanding onto the green belt. A melange of persons carriers, large 4x4s, taxis and private cars strangle the tiny country roads between Bath and the airport. I know this because it's en route past where I live, and it really is dangerous to drive down these roads. The roads are just not equipped for it, and what we really fear is that somebody will say, oh, let's widen them. It's not necessary. They're country roads and should remain the same. The airport, they try to fudge the issue by saying, we will determine the impact on local and rural road networks around the airport and develop appropriate mitigation measures where necessary, which is a long-winded way of saying do nothing for 20 years, because that's exactly what they've done, nothing. The small country lanes remain overused and dangerous, but BIA do not care. They just get bigger and bigger multi-story car parks on site with a not very polite, may I say it, 2 fingers to the local society. There it is, put up with it. BIA have always ignored climate change. It was always an irritant that they could do without, because they were essentially interested in the bottom line of their balance sheet and what they could pay their shareholders, most of whom live outside Britain and still do, and I think you're hearing from Canada later today. Those of us with a more caring attitude to the world have a different point of view, and aircraft are the biggest source of air pollution in the world, and without aircraft flying over, even during the pandemic, scientists have noticed reductions already in the quality of air in Bristol, which I think is brilliant. And they've also noted reductions in the rate of ice decrease around the poles because less aircraft have been in the air. Surely organisations like this, which are looking into whether this airport should expand again, must take these important bits of information on board, because they matter to the whole of the rest of the world, not just here. It's crucial stuff. I've lost myself. If that's not enough sufficiently persuasive for the appeal, I would simply point you towards the unbelievable disaster you've just seen in Europe with Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg and Holland, with hundreds known to be dead and many more hundreds missing, with swollen rivers and collapsed dams. In North America and the western states, they're suffering hugely with forest fires, and the fire brigades can't cope with it. And again, there's a considerable loss of property and life. Last year, Australia suffered grotesquely with forest fires, with associated loss of properties and lives. And only yesterday, China had people drowning in their underground system where the rivers burst their banks and flowed down into the underground. What a way to leave this world. Terrible. I would like to remind people here that in 1968 we had terrible floods from Chew Valley. They flooded down, right down into Keynsham. Cars were wiped off the bridge there. People died in those cars. And it's just an example of what could happen here. All the chat that you get from the airport is about how they're reducing noise and air pollution. And it's for meetings like this that they make those statements. And they also like it for sound bites. and television and radio. We sadly get used to it from all walks of life these days. What should happen and what is actually happening don't equate. The reality is less flights need to be the rule of the day, not more flights. To achieve this, BIA want to increase travellers to 20 million a year. Companies like BIA and other airports offset their dangerous emissions by paying other nations to accept their emission levels. And these countries don't exceed their own levels, and so they're prepared to take the cash, and we have to put up with the pollution that goes on locally that the local airports are paying for. What a sad reflection on British people that they require less fortunate individuals to accept our pollution excesses in order that British people can enjoy 2 weeks holiday at their expense. Near the end now. On top of this, in towns and cities like Bath, commercial traffic is now having to pay large sums of money to take their vehicles into the city to prevent the build-up of noxious and poisonous gases that cause breathing problems and potentially death to fellow citizens. Why do BIA want to further contribute towards these problems? I'm sure if the roles were reversed, BIA would be up in arms to protect their shareholders. And of course, Bath is at serious risk of losing its UNESCO World Heritage City status. Planes contribute very, very seriously towards this. There's so much more that needs to be said, but in 10 minutes, I've probably said all that is going to be relevant to today. And I would simply say, last time we won 2-1 against the airport expanding, but what happened? Mr. Pickles, in government, called in the findings and just changed it. So all the effort that we put into the first "Don't let Bristol Airport expand" were lost by a simple government overruling. I doubt if Mr. Pickles even knew where Lulsgate was. If he did, and he's listening, perhaps he'll tell me whether he knew at the time. So where does democracy stand when the electorate are ignored by central government for the sake of allowing the greatest polluter of the atmosphere to continue taking people on holidays which they could take much nearer home? And I just hope that North Somerset Council, who I admire enormously, continue to say no, no, no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Syrett. Can you make sure your speaking notes are sent in to the programme officer? Could you email your speaking notes, could you email them to the case officer?
I sent them to Joanna, I think.
Already done, thank you.
Does that ring a bell? Yes, I think they went there.
Thank you.
But I will check.
Right. I don't believe, unless the programme officer is going to look at me and tell me otherwise, that we've got anybody waiting either virtually or in the room to speak. Is that? Daisy? No, Daisy Noble is the... that's just...
No, there was a name, it's gone.
I think she's coming forward.
I've still got 4 or 5.
I've got these names left: James Drury, Carla Denyer, Sarah Poppy Jackson, Richard Bonner and Terry Burgess. They're the only names we've got left, and they're not with us at the moment.
China might be Phillips in, but if not, we can take a break and see if they're...
Yeah, we'll take a break and see if we can round up. Blackster, Alison Blackster.
Joe Tristram, who is on the list.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, shall we hear from them and then we'll take a break? Yeah. Hi, Miss Blackster. Are you joining us? Oh.
Hearing aids. Try Joe Tristram.
Is she on the list?
Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Tristram.
Yeah.
Who's that?
He's AB.
Okay. Mr. Tristan. Mr. Tristram, are you there? Turn your camera on and your microphone. Should we have a break? Mr. Tristram, can you hear us? No, somebody else. Okay, I think should we take a break? We'll take a short adjournment and we'll come back and see if we can get the technology sorted out. Should we come back at 3:05? Okay, the inquiry is adjourned. Who's the other one there? Amy Fletcher. That's not. Okay, it's 3:05. The inquiry is now resumed. Just looking at Teams, I can see if we have some names on there which are familiar and that they're on my list. So let me just see. I think we have Mr. Jury. Mr. James Jury, are you there? Do you want to turn your camera on and your microphone on and introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Good afternoon. Shall I proceed with my statement?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, my name's James Jury, and as the Chief Executive of Bristol Chamber of Commerce, which operates at the Centre of Business West, I'm speaking today on behalf of our members in favour of the proposals by Bristol Airport to enhance and grow its capacity up to 12 million passengers a year in a sustainable and measured way. As the leading voice and resource of businesses in the Bristol, West of England and wider region, including North Somerset, where we are actually based, we represent over 22,000 businesses and employers, from the smallest to the largest, and across all sectors. Bristol Airport is part of the UK's national infrastructure and an important regional hub and gateway for international connectivity, bringing visitors and investors to the region, allowing businesses to connect with customers domestically and across the world. Our members consider a successful airport as an important ingredient in the long-term prosperity of our area, improving connectivity and benefiting employment, and so is a crucial part of our regional transport infrastructure and our global connectivity. We recognise that sustaining a successful regional airport that operates a wide network of scheduled flights has a positive influence on trade, inward investment and business location decisions. And the ability to do business in international markets in a post-Brexit environment without having to make lengthy surface journeys, often by car, to airports outside the region saves considerable cost, time and surface miles. Constraining this region's main airport with this application risks, we believe, cutting business off from the world or forcing them to use airports outside the region, as I've mentioned, putting the region at a competitive disadvantage. Access to Bristol Airport's route network also contributes to individuals' quality of life, helping to make the region an attractive place to live, work, visit, particularly for international residents who may particularly value air links to friends and family across the world. Bristol and the wider region has very strong international trading and business connections with key sectors that are reliant upon excellent European and global connectivity for their labour, customer base and for supplier, investor and inter-firm relationships. We do recognise that aviation is currently a significant contributor to carbon emissions and that change is needed in the industry to reduce its overall carbon impact. We welcome the publication last week of the government's Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Business employers across our region are committed to meeting net zero targets, and significant investment will be required to meet these targets, supported by business growth. And an expansion of Bristol Airport will facilitate growth whilst allowing the investment required to meet the target of a net zero airport. We also recognise that Bristol Airport is demonstrating it is actively working to reduce carbon emissions arising from its own operations, and has clearly set out its ambition to be the greenest airport in the country, including with this expansion plan by becoming carbon neutral for direct emissions 4 years ahead of its previous target, and a net zero airport by 2030. And further now move to put itself and our region at the forefront of innovation, proving a testbed for new clean technology. We know there is much more to do right across the aerospace and aviation sectors, which have a major footprint in this region, but also have major ambitions and continuing investment to do just this. We are encouraged by the commitments made by Bristol Airport through Jet Zero and sustainable aviation, and also that government and industry are committed to move to more long-term investment, innovation and interventions to decarbonise. Carbon reduction is part of a broader challenge for all businesses, where reductions in carbon are needed across all economic sectors and other sources of emissions, from energy to transport, food and beyond. For us to achieve these carbon reductions, we need a coherent government plan for reducing carbon emissions to hit our international targets and limit the impact of climate change. This has to be done nationally by the UK government. Reducing carbon will involve economic costs, trade-offs and interventions that need to be managed and agreed nationally. We don't believe we can have the UK's aviation policy and its climate strategy done in an uncoordinated way by a single local authority planning committee. If this happens, it would damage our regional connectivity whilst broadly shifting the carbon problem elsewhere as the number of flights grew in other locations. The recent decision at Stansted showed that the expansion of the UK's airport capacity is already happening elsewhere at a scale much larger than that proposed in the Bristol application. So for this reason, we do not think an ad hoc decision to limit aviation capacity only at Bristol Airport by one local authority is the right way to proceed. A decision to limit or reduce flying should be taken by national government as part of a broader democratic process alongside a coherent national carbon reduction plan. As part of the proposals, we strongly support the airport's plans to implement new public transport targets, new bus and coach services, improvements to the A38 are all welcomed by business in this region, and improving sustainable transport links to the airport will increase connectivity and indeed enhance business use to the airport. So Bristol Airport, just to finish off, Bristol Airport is a significant hub of economic activity in its own right, supporting thousands of jobs on site and across local supply chains. Furthermore, we note that Bristol Airport draws its employees disproportionately from South Bristol and Weston-super-Mare, both areas in which employment opportunities are more limited than in other parts of the region. The planned development and additional passenger volumes through the airport are projected to add 710 direct jobs to the airport and move to increase indirect jobs to 5,000 across our region and deliver an estimated £430 million into the South West and also South Wales economy at a challenging time for the sector and indeed our national economy. So on behalf of our members, we therefore support Bristol Airport's appeal against North Somerset Council's decision to refuse permission to increase and enhance its capacity to accommodate passengers to 12 million per annum. We hope these plans are ultimately approved so the airport can then move forward with its plans, which will benefit businesses and local people alike into the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dury. Have you sent your speaking notes to the programme officer?
I haven't. I can do that immediately.
I'm grateful. Just wait there because there may be some questions for you from some of the advocates. Let me just go around the room. Mr. Henderson?
A few, if I may, sir.
Yep.
Thank you. Mr. Dewey, I want to talk about your statement that you made 22nd of February 2021 that you sent to the Planning Inspectorate. Do you have a copy there?
I do. I'll just get it in front of me.
Great. Let me know when you've got hold of that.
Do I need to look that up?
If you've got it, sir, then that's probably easier to follow along. I'll give you the paragraph references, though, for your note. So, and I'll read out the relevant bit, but if you have it, it might be easier.
Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. I'll get it open in front of me. I had a number of documents open.
It's only 3 questions, but it's easier, I think, if we all look at the right document.
You carry on now.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I've got it in front of me now.
Great. Can I ask you to look firstly at paragraph 11 of that, please, Mr. Dewey?
Certainly.
Final sentence of paragraph 11. You say that the Bristol Chamber of Commerce Initiative as part of Business West is itself committed to achieve a net zero carbon emissions by 2030. Do you see that?
I do indeed.
Yeah. You're aware that the government's target is to achieve net zero by 2050, aren't you?
I am indeed.
So it's fair to say then that you've decided that actually you need to act much quicker than that by achieving matters of net zero in 2030, not 2050. That's fair, isn't it?
Yes, that's fair.
Thank you. Can I ask you to turn over the page, please? Paragraph 13. Penultimate sentence in this paragraph. You say, we believe there's an opportunity for Bristol to put itself at the forefront of innovation, providing a testbed for new, clean technology. Have you seen any commitment that Bristol Airport will provide and adopt sustainable aviation fuel ahead of other airports?
I could tell you in terms of comparison with other airports, I have seen certainly some commitments to start to work in the clean aviation space around, and with some of the other airport partners around clean aviation. I couldn't give you, I couldn't categorically give you the kind of specifics or the dates or the size of the commitment, but I know that they are actively engaged with, as I say, some of their direct partners, airlines, etc., around this.
That's perfectly fair. We'll obviously explore that with the airport's witnesses in due course, but let's just put the hypothetical. Let's assume that we identify some measures that the airport could be taking but aren't taken. It'd be fair to say that on that basis you would consider that to be a missed opportunity, given what you say in your paragraph 13. That would be fair, wouldn't it?
I think I would say really that there is a very strong commitment at the airport, and we have, and I think our business community would be, and our members will be encouraging the airport to go, to decarbonise as far as it is within their ability as a business to do so. So I couldn't comment on any kind of alignment about what and when and how far they've gone, but I certainly know that there are some strong commitments they made even in recent weeks to around being net carbon as an airport itself, in terms of their direct emissions now, and then net carbon zero by bringing forward some of the commitments they'd made previously.
Okay, thank you. Final question, paragraph 14, so just below where we were looking. Final sentence here, you say, providing more destinations and improved flight schedules from Bristol Airport will help to reduce these inefficiencies, and they're the inefficiencies you're talking about for business travellers. Do you know which new business destinations will be provided if the airport expands?
I think there is a longer term ambition, I would say, whether there's actually a formal, I don't think there'll be a formal contract, but an ambition certainly to bring back a transatlantic service. I think there would be the opportunity, as I understand it, to have more frequent services into European destinations, into Germany and elsewhere, into Paris, for instance, which provide, I suppose, a better service for business customers who wanting to move it in and out of those markets, and it gives them more choice.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jury. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Good. I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that you've just said. You're probably aware from the usage of the airport from 2019, so pre-pandemic, when things were perhaps relatively normal. The airport, being permitted to carry up to 10 million passengers, had 8.9 million passengers, in fact, going through it. So there was the capability of another million passengers. Do you accept that had there been a demand for example, financially viable flights that were based on those figures, that other services could have been provided?
Sorry, can you ask? I missed the last bit of that question. Sorry.
Do you accept, given that there was the capacity for another 1.1 million passengers, that if there was commercial demand for them, that there was capacity for the airport to provide those flights?
I think the airport, I would observe over the last a number of years has been growing, and I guess it's been growing in line with what the market has been demanding, but also and therefore the industry and the airlines, etc., are able to offer those services. I think I don't know specifically about as it were the latent demand, but I certainly know that this application is about a long-term plan to provide the right level of connectivity. So it's dealing with a continuing forecast increase in growth, and in this region, in certain areas, certainly a growing demand.
Okay, and maybe you mentioned so far as that your aspirations are concerned, that you hoped that there would be a resumption of flights to the United States direct from Bristol Airport?
Yes, by way of an example, but I think providing connectivity to where business want to travel is part of what we want and need from an airport, and this region needs for this airport and its business community.
Well,
so yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to stop you speaking.
Well, yeah, no. So I was just making the point that the right connectivity to the right places is what the business community will our members will be seeking.
And you'll be aware, won't you, from your living locally, that there used to be a flight service direct from Bristol Airport to the United States?
There was for a few years.
And that ceased because it wasn't commercially supported?
It was ceased as part of the, as I recall, the impact of the financial crisis in 2008 and the pressures within the airline that was being operated. I think, as I understand it at the time, and you'd need to clearly verify this of others, that it wasn't about it not being profitable, but about that other routes were more profitable.
So what your belief is that there was a commercially viable service running to the United States, but there were better services?
Well, that clearly the airline who was running it, as I understood, had a number of different options from which it could base itself. It came under some pressure from the impact of 2008, and then decided to need to make some cutbacks. And one of those was the route from the direct daily route out of Bristol. But that as I understood it, that service was a profitable service, but wasn't as profitable as some of the other services.
So that your understanding is, even though they had an extra 1 million passengers a year capacity on a profitable service, they closed it down?
Yes, I think that they were under other pressures as an airline, which meant that they had to make decisions on a number of different routes, including the route out of Bristol into the US.
Okay. Changing the subject now to your discussion, your evidence about carbon. You're aware, aren't you, that you will be aware that the carbon dioxide now produced by international aviation is now part of the 6th carbon budget. It's now counted in the requirements for carbon reduction.
Right. Okay.
Okay. And what that means is that if Bristol Airport expands, in order to meet the additional carbon dioxide emissions from Bristol Airport, that other parts of the UK economy will have to take a larger reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. So the question following from that is, do you accept that, well, following on from that, do you know if your members are happy to shoulder the burden of carrying those additional carbon dioxide reductions?
Well, okay, sorry.
I don't think that isn't a question that I think that our members would expect to be shouldering all the burden of in any sector, extra emissions. But I'm not sure how else I can answer your question, really. But I think we've taken some quite careful soundings of members, and we do that over a long period. And the statement I read out really reflects I think the balanced position we take around recognising the carbon issue, but also then recognising the value of connectivity. And I think the approach that the airport, and indeed I believe the aviation sector, which I say a lot of it is, we have a big footprint in our region, is moving in that direction. So it is making its commitment to reduce, and it needs to do that in business terms within in order to support that investment. Business, of course, needs to be able to invest in these things, and it needs that ability to grow in order to make that commitment and that investment.
Mr. Morehouse, might help if you could restrict your questions to matters that were covered by the witness. It's perhaps going a little bit outside, it might be better for the climate change, the appellant's climate change witness to answer some of these questions, perhaps.
So I'd understood that he had given evidence about the carbon impact in chief effectively a little while ago, and all I was inviting was his own consideration of the implications of what he was supporting and whether his members would support that, because he also gave evidence that he represented business interests who will have to shoulder those burdens, and there's no doubt about that.
I think you get my point.
Yes, but this is a reference, I assume, to the UK emission trading scheme. Now, what you might properly have said to him is there are other sectors, for example, energy within the UK emission trading scheme. That's a cap and trade scheme, and therefore airlines may have to buy credits from other energy. Now, I don't know to what extent the witness knows about that, but that's not really for him.
It's not. It's reference to the legal obligations under the Climate Act.
Which one?
The target set under Section 1.
Well, the target set under Section 1 is a target that relates to the net UK carbon account in 2050. That applies to everything. It's the mechanisms under which that are delivered, a combination of budgets and then other mechanisms that I just, with the best will in the world, I just don't think the witness is going to be able to help you with. There will be other witnesses.
And that's my point, I think.
So I have no further questions.
Okay. Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much. I call you James. James, we know each other outside this room. Thank you for your evidence. Can you confirm whether Business West have declared a climate emergency?
No, we, as an organisation, at the end of last year, declared what we describe as a climate crisis. We, no. So, yeah, that's the answer to that question.
So, a climate crisis. Okay, thank you. What would be your normal understanding of the word crisis?
A situation which we need to take seriously and make steps to address.
Okay. And do you think that's what your members understood when they agreed with this declaration that you made?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that that's not really reflected in your statement of support to this inquiry?
What isn't reflected, sorry?
Well, perhaps I can take you to your climate declaration, I think it's called, on your website. Climate statement on your website. It says it contains numerous promises and commitments around climate issues. It says climate change is the defining issue of our time. There could be no prosperous future generated at the expense of the environment, and numerous other statements and comments and commitments like that. My question is that view, are those views which you say are the views of your members, are they reflected in the statement you've made to this inquiry?
As a business organisation, we've made some commitments to climate, and we work within a pragmatic world of business, and we've made a statement related to the growth of our airport, which is focused around, on balance, what the view of our members is, and it's reflecting, and as I said in the statement, really recognising absolutely the issue around carbon and the environment, but recognising the steps that the airport and the aviation industry are taking, and that on balance, we think that our members believe that the airport's growth should go ahead.
So, do you recognise there's a range of views within the members of your organisation?
I think you might imagine in any business community and any membership organisation, there are going to be there'll be a number of different views, but I think the very strong consensus is the one that I've set out in the piece and the statement I've made and the submission we made back in February.
Presumably you are aware of a recent questionnaire that Business West put around to their members, and one of the responses was that nearly 3/4 of your members consider climate change as a core business issue. Again, I'm not sure that's reflected in, or do you think that's reflected in your statement? Perhaps the question I'll ask is, have you specifically asked your members whether they support the expansion of Bristol Airport?
As I said to the previous question, we've taken soundings over a long period and in more times.
Sorry,
so,
James,
yes.
just on that specific issue, have you asked them, do you have a survey that says X number of our members support this expansion?
We don't have a survey specific to that, but then we don't on specific issues. We've done that polling around the business's view around climate, and you reference, I think, one of the statistics that comes out of that, and we thought long and hard about the view that we take around the airport's position and its expansion, and that's the view we've come out with, which is that, as I say, the consensus view of our members.
Consensus, but you haven't asked them the specific question. Is that correct?
We don't ask members specific questions. We work through a number of different ways to garner different views on specifics, and this is a view which has been signed off by our board.
Okay, thank you. Have you read the evidence that's been put into this inquiry by NEF that refers to the severely negative consequences to many businesses of the climate crisis?
I'm aware of it, but I must admit I don't have the. I haven't read in detail, but I have. I know we've had colleagues who've been looking at that in more detail, and as I say, we've taken a balanced view in the approach and that we put forward.
You say a balanced view, but it's fair to say that your statement is pretty much completely in support of the airport's expansion. I mean, on reflection, having answered the questions that you've answered, do you not feel that the statement could have reflected the other side of the argument as well?
Well, I think we have brought out quite clearly the seriousness we take around the environment, climate, also around, and in that respect, but also in impact on communities, the need to improve transport. And I have to say, we have been, I think, very clear to the airport that we want and need them to go faster around their commitments and to move faster in terms of decarbonising their own operations, how they get people to the airport, and that the industry as a whole, I think, accelerates around clean aviation. So, there is a journey that we across, as my piece said, around lots of different parts of business, of which climate change is clearly has a factor, and aviation is one of those.
But just returning to the evidence you've given to this inquiry, your evidence doesn't state we support the expansion of Bristol Airport, but it's conditional on these other things happening, does it?
Well, you've read the statement from February.
Sorry, say again.
You've seen the statement we submitted in February.
Well, it's your statement. I'm asking you the question. I mean, I've expressed my views, but do you think that those conditional issues that you've just raised as being necessary for you to support the expansion are reflected in this statement?
We made clear to the airport the position that we've taken, and it's set out in the statement in February, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, James.
Thank you, Mr. Jury. I think we're finished with you now. Can you make sure you send your speaking notes into the programme officer?
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to hear next from Sarah Poppy Jackson.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for giving me your time. Firstly, I'm sleep deprived. I haven't slept for longer than 4 hours in 6 months, so be patient with me. I've got some points to make. I'm representing Chew Valley Extinction Rebellion Group, but firstly, I'm representing Maya, my 6-month-old daughter. She might speak throughout this, so I apologise if she takes the stage. I also represent all the children who don't have a voice here, and they're the ones that will be dealing with the future that we're now paving the way of. There's some indigenous traditions in North America that have something called the Children's Fire, and the leaders within the communities have this fire burning all the time to represent the children of the 7 generations ahead, and not just human children, but all species. And it's there to remind them to make ethical decisions at all times to consider those future generations. I'd like you to consider that today, please. So just a little bit of background about who I am. I've been an activist for 15 years. Started with Greenpeace many years ago when I was working in London in the corporate sector in marketing. I did an undergraduate degree in economics and more recently a master's in regenerative economics. And now I live just outside of Bristol and I work on some land which is in 3 miles of the airport, doing regenerative work and education with young people and nature connection, planting trees, teaching children to cycle, and living as low carbon a lifestyle as I possibly can. So let's talk about Chew Valley Extinction Rebellion. So the 3 key demands for Extinction Rebellion are, yes, Maya. Number 1, tell the truth. So, you know, any of you here today who've read the news can see there's absolute chaos going on around the world with the weather. You can't deny that. There are floods in China, catastrophic floods in Italy, there's burning in Canada and North America, heat waves, people are dying. In fact, 1 in 5 deaths right now globally are directly linked to fossil fuels. That's a University College London study that came out earlier this year. I can give you the reference to that. So yeah, read the news. Read the news. It's devastating. It's very scary. And even David Attenborough is telling us to, to wake up. We all like David. Everyone gets to listen to David, haven't they? So another truth, tell the truth. 80% of the world's population have never stepped foot on a plane. 80%. I can back that up with a reference as well. This is not normal. Flying is not normal. It's not what the majority world do. It's a minority world luxury, and it needs to decline. Another truth for the UK, to bring it home, 70% of all flights are taken by 15% of the population. I'm sure you've heard this before the last couple of days. 70% of the flights are taken by 15% of the population, and that just highlights the inequalities that exist economically in this country. So the second demand of XR is zero carbon by 2025. Some people may be surprised by that date because it's not long to go. 2050 is too long. The facts, again, like I said earlier, 1 in 5 deaths are now directly linked to fossil fuels. Planes burn fossil fuels. Tarmacking the green belt, increasing vehicles to the airport, and increasing flights is not cutting carbon. It's just a fact. It's not lowering carbon. The third demand by XR is citizens' assemblies. This is, in other words, deliberative democracy. And this is where I bring in these books. So back in February last year, I stood here and celebrated as the expansion got turned down by all the councillors here in North Somerset, by 84% of North Somerset residents, local residents, turned down the expansion. And in these 2 books here, there are 11,500 comments. These are the objections, and these are supporting. I think that says enough. This is democracy right here. And I'm shocked we're even standing here today having an appeal. When I think about what Maya might say today, I think about the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. Don't know if any of you remember that one. And the Emperor pays these tricksters, these merchants, to dress him in these beautiful silk robes. Oh, you look so wonderful, they say. But actually, he's completely naked. And the whole town laugh at him. But the whole town laugh at him after the child stands there and points and says, he's naked, because everyone else thinks he's wearing these beautiful silks, because they just agree with him. They just agree because it's business as usual. Believe the emperor, believe the economics. And that's what it feels like. We're all just tricking ourselves. For me, this whole situation feels totally absurd. It feels absurd that I'm standing here. It really does. And Maya would be pointing right now at the airport marketeers, who I know very well will be doing the work that I got trained to do many years ago, which is to tell the public what they want to hear. You know, the silk robes of greenwashing, carbon neutral airport. Carbon neutral airport, it burns fossil fuels. There is no possible way an airport or any airline industry can be carbon neutral. I'm sorry, can we just point at the nakedness of this situation? It's ridiculous. The truth is, flying burns fossil fuels. The truth is, the Committee on Climate Change, that's for the government, independent Committee on Climate Change, have said no more net expansion of airports. Listen to the climate scientists. I know your jobs are planners and you're looking at exceptional circumstances for why this should happen, but you need to listen to the climate scientists, not the economists. Economists are not scientists. I've studied economics, it is not a science. They're theories. And this one doesn't add up. So I ask you, the airport is big enough already. Please listen to the climate science. And I wish you the courage to make the ethical decision for the good of all. Thank you.
Any questions? No? Thank you, Ms. Poppy Jackson. Will you also make sure that the programme officer has a copy of your speaking notes, if you can? And well done on multitasking. Mr. Bonner, do we have Richard Bonner? I think virtually.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You want to introduce yourself and then you can give
Thank
your
you.
statement?
Yes. So I'm Richard Bonner. I'm a partner of an organisation called Arcadis. We're a design consultancy for natural and built assets. And in a personal capacity, I am the president of the Bristol Chamber of Commerce and Initiative, and a board member of the West of England Local Enterprise Partnership. And I'm speaking today to express Arcadis' support to the airport's planning appeal to increase capacity from 10 to 12 million passengers per annum. We recognise that the airport is a key enabler for economic growth in jobs and connectivity, generating value to the southwest economy and connecting people, and certainly to the 500 Arcadians in the southwest, from Bristol to Exeter, to many destinations which we need from a business perspective. We also recognise that it supports the jobs that support our organisation and many others in the region. We believe that the airport's role is going to increasingly be important in helping to generate a post-COVID recovery and to support the growth of industry, not least of which ours, in the coming years. And we're pleased to see that many of those jobs will be in important areas of deprivation, both within Bristol and more widely. As one of the largest built and natural environment consultancies, we also are reassured that the airport is taking their carbon reduction footprint very seriously. We have seen from their progress that they are a leading airport, pioneering sustainability through their operations, reducing emissions already, and starting to generate their electricity on site through renewables as part of their plan. But we also recognise that the plans proposed help to reduce the carbon footprint from service access, improving public transport and public accessibility, and more generally reducing carbon through their operations. And we understand that their carbon neutrality has been delivered 4 years earlier than their originally stated plan. We do recognise that carbon reduction is a challenge for the infrastructure industry more generally, and we have noted that the aviation industry has already made great strides through the carbon roadmap and are working to adopt sustainable fuels, reducing operations and taking other measures. Bristol Airport's ambition to become net zero by 2030 complements those measures, we believe, and demonstrates its commitment to balancing the benefits and impacts of future airport growth. As a member of the Southwest business community, we believe growth at the airport will help to drive the region forwards. That's an important measure to help to take business, industry and population at large on the journey to transform. And we also believe that the growth at the airport will help to avoid any disadvantages that may occur if we restrict the growth at Bristol Airport rather than other locations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonner. Let me just see if there's any questions in the room. No. Mr. Morehouse, do you want to put any questions?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear, Mr. Bonner, which organisation you said you came from.
I'm representing Arcadis today. That's my statement. It's on behalf of my organisation, Arcadis. I just mentioned that in my personal capacity, my experience of working in the region is through roles such as the President of the Chamber of Commerce and through my involvement with the Local Enterprise Partnership.
Thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Morehouse?
Not from me, no, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Clark?
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Bonner. You said that this will be a key enabler for growth. Have you read the evidence that's been put into this inquiry about by NEF that says that the economic growth, the possible economic growth, has been much exaggerated, actually? Have you read that evidence?
I've not personally read the NEF report, Mr. Clark.
I missed that, sorry.
I've not read the NEF report, Mr. Clark.
Okay, thank you. You said that this would lead to more jobs in disadvantaged areas. Are you aware that, according to the airport's own figures, in South Bristol, there will be an extra 90 jobs? Do you how significant do you think those 90 jobs are compared with the environmental damage that this expansion will cause?
I think that the ability to create jobs in many of the disadvantaged areas in and around Bristol is an important challenge for the wider functioning economy of the region. I think that's important.
Okay, thank you. You said that, I think what you said is you said that there would be a reduction in carbon through the operations of Bristol airports. I'm not sure I fully understand that. Are you saying that if, excuse me, if permission is given for 2 million extra passengers, this will mean a reduction in the carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere?
Our understanding is that through the operations of the airport, they will achieve net zero carbon.
So you think with 2 million extra passengers, there will be less carbon emitted into the high atmosphere than there would have been if those 2 million passengers hadn't flown from Bristol Airport? Yes or no is fine.
I think, you know, from our own perspective, if we have restrictions on where we can travel and needed to perhaps go to other airports away from Bristol, I think our own expectations are that actually the balance is that your carbon could increase in the overall travel journey.
Are you aware that the business travel by air has reduced, before the pandemic, had reduced by 1/3 from its peak?
In our own organisation, we've seen some reductions in and through the pandemic. We recognise that, like a lot of organisations, we need to be careful in making those investments to travel.
So do you think it's likely that post-pandemic, members of your organisation will use air travel for business as much as they have done in the past?
We have found that in some instances, our clients need us to be able to access markets around the UK. So it's a difficult question to answer, Mr. Clark, but we have business needs that mean we need to fly between different places in Europe to satisfy our clients' needs.
Mr. Clark, they may be better questions, I think, for the forecasting experts. I think you're putting questions to this witness well beyond his experience.
If I could just ask a question that is within his capacity to answer.
Just try and do it. Try and do it more neutrally if you can as well.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Does your organisation use Zoom and other remote ways of holding meetings?
Yes.
Do you consider it's likely that post-pandemic you will consider to use Zoom and other ways of communicating that don't involve travel physically?
Like many organisations, we will blend between face-to-face activity and Zoom team-related activity. That is, yes, the case.
Okay, thank you.
So may I ask one question? It's Mr. Morehouse over here. It's simply just to put context to this, depending obviously upon the answer. Thank you. Mr. Bonner, Arcadis, I've had the opportunity now to have a look at them. Is it right that Arcadis were appointed by the Civil Aviation Authority as its economic consultancy service? Is that the business you work with?
Our organisation has and does work in the aviation industry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bonner, will you make sure that your speaking notes are emailed into the programme officer?
Of course, yeah, will do. Thank you.
Thank you for coming this afternoon.
So just as a factual point, Mr. Smith said entirely incorrectly that business travel had declined by 1/3. I assume he means at Bristol. The actual figures are at figure 14 on page 51 of Mr. Brass's evidence. They actually increased from 0.78 million in 2003 to 1.12 million in 2019. That is not a decline by a third.
With respect, perhaps I didn't make this clear, I wasn't talking about Bristol Airport, I was talking nationally in the UK. Perhaps I should have made that clear, thank you. I'm happy to provide that reference to confirm that.
Thanks for the clarification. Okay, we're going to go to Carla Denyer. Good afternoon, Ms. Denyer.
Good afternoon. Would you like me to start by reading the open letter? Or
Yeah, just introduce yourself. Are you a local resident or who you're speaking for? And then you can go ahead.
Thank you. So my name is Carla Denyer. I am an elected city councillor in Bristol. And today I'm presenting to you an open letter to the inquiry from 35 Green Party and independent councillors across the west of England. So I'll start by reading that, if that's okay. I've also already submitted it in writing. We write to you to emphasise the crucial importance of the climate and ecological emergency in your consideration of this appeal. We are Green Party and independent councillors who've been working at every level of government to try to ensure a swift and very genuine transition to a net zero carbon UK. Together, we represent 265,833 residents in the west of England, including North Somerset, which is 22.9% of the population of this sub-region. It is absolutely crucial to our survival that we take the need to reduce greenhouse gases very seriously indeed. We no longer have the luxury of making the wrong decisions about the effects of our actions on the climate. Time is too short. Report after report tells us that we are in imminent danger of reaching irreversible and catastrophic tipping points in the overheating of the planet. And no project is too large or too small to play its part in preventing this. Bristol Airport may try to make the case that its proposed expansion will only increase the problem by a small amount, but any increases it causes are unacceptable. This proposal specifically comes at a time when we are asking people to engage with the climate emergency and make personal choices to lessen their carbon footprint, even in small ways. How can we ask this of individuals if businesses such as the airport are permitted to undermine such efforts by expanding and adding dramatically to the problem? The proposed expansion by Bristol Airport at this time will negate a very significant proportion of the carbon saving that our local councils and residents are working so hard to achieve. The most recent advice on aviation from the Climate Change Committee, as I know you've heard from others, is that there should be no net airport expansion at this point in time. And the CCC's recommendation on airports confirms the validity of the decision which North Somerset Council took in February 2020. The planning inquiry, as you know, is bound by the National Planning Policy Framework, which states the planning system should support the transition to a low-carbon future in a changing climate and should help to shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We do not believe that overturning the decision taken by North Somerset Council and allowing Bristol Airport to expand would be, quote, shaping places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, unquote. Please respect the decision taken by North Somerset Council on this issue. And this letter, as I say, is signed by 35 councillors, that is 10 Green and Independent councillors in North Somerset, 24 Green Party councillors in Bristol and 1 Green Party councillor in Bath and North East Somerset. And it's worth mentioning that this is not the sum total of councillors who oppose Bristol Airport expansion, as we only approached Green and Independent councillors for this letter, and so you may hear from elected representatives from other parties separately.
Okay, Thank you, Councillor. Has that letter already been submitted to the inquiry, do you know?
It has, yes, on Monday.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Questions? No? No questions. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon.
Okay. As there are no questions, I was anticipating there might be, would I just be able to draw attention and draw out one thing a little bit more, only to take an extra couple of minutes?
Are you okay with that? Yeah? Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. I won't be long. Just on sort of not introducing new issues, but related to what I've just said, there's a strong democratic mandate for opposing Bristol Airport expansion. So you've heard about the people that have signed this open letter, but that's not the extent of that democratic mandate. In addition to that, Bristol City Council voted in a full council meeting in December 2020 to oppose airport expansion because it was incompatible with our carbon targets. North Somerset, of course, refused the application directly. Bath and North East Somerset submitted a formal objection through the planning process and passed a motion opposing expansion. And the newly elected Metro Mayor, in manifestos, hustings and interviews since election, has confirmed his position against Bristol Airport expansion. So I'm here really to represent the democratic mandate that they have here. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that climate emergency declarations are a material consideration to this decision, and there is precedent in climate emergency declarations being considered as material to planning decisions in the past, Genetec versus North Norfolk in 2020. I'm sure somebody else will be going into that in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, so it's the Ontario. Right, do we have Terry Burgess on Teams?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello there. Good afternoon, or good
Hello.
morning, whatever it is.
Thank you. It is morning.
Do you want to introduce yourself, and then you're free to give your the statement to the inquiry?
Yes, thank you. Please tell me if you can't hear me very well. It is a long way. Okay, thank you. Well, I hope everybody is well. Thanks for allowing me to speak today. I'm actually a teacher in northwestern Ontario in Canada. So I live on the north shore of the biggest lake in the world, Lake Superior, and I'm halfway between Winnipeg and Toronto. I actually teach 13-year-olds, which some people think is kind of crazy, but I love it. And I actually own the airport. Perhaps you're surprised by that, but I own the airport completely, me and 331,000 other members of my pension plan. So I'm speaking to you as an owner of the airport. And I'm also speaking on behalf of at least 600, there are more, but 600 people who have formally signed on to objecting to our pension plan investing in fossil fuels, and I'll get into that more in a moment. You've had lots of speakers today, and I was aware that I was going to be toward the end, so I'm trying to keep my remarks short. We know that the airport expansion is morally wrong. Certainly Sarah Poppy Jackson gave us lots of good information about that. Local people don't want it. From the news, it seems from here that many of your neighbors over on the continent are at risk of flooding. Over here in Canada, we are at risk of burning. So unfortunately, a couple weeks ago, one of the towns in Canada set a record for the highest temperature we've ever had in all of Canada. People think it's cold here. It was 49.6 degrees Celsius. And 3 days later, the whole town burned to the ground. That was Lytton, BC. It made the BBC. Crops are withering in their fields. Even as I'm speaking to you now, I'm realizing I'm neglecting one of my duties as a parent, because one of the fires right now, the number of fires in Ontario right now is double the 10-year average, the number of fires right now. There's one burning out of control an hour away from me, so my next task after I get off of the list here with you is to go and pack an emergency bin in case I need to evacuate my children. So it's clear from my comments and Sarah Poppy Jackson's comments that this panel needs to choose between the economic benefits and the convenience for a small group of people, and the physical safety and mental health for another group of people, it's not a theoretical choice. I think back in the 70s, when I was first learning about climate change, we thought that this was a long way off, but it is here now. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's not something that's happening to other people. It's happening to real people right now. So there are moral reasons for preventing further expansion of fossil fuel intensive activities, of course, but it's also an unwise financial investment. So it's interesting that as a teacher, I'm also just happened to be interested in the investment world. And so I've read about regulatory risks and policy risks, etc. So as extreme heat and floods and fires continue, governments are going to be forced to adopt new policies that are going to curtail fossil fuel use. They're just going to have to. Their citizens are going to demand it. So that doesn't make, as this is my pension money, it doesn't make this a good investment even for the owners of this airport. There are certainly plenty of other ways to make money. You could ask Microsoft, as we're using Teams today, or Zoom or Google. So in January of this year, my pension fund announced its commitment to zero emissions. We're hearing a lot about that. We're also hearing the year 2050. And despite our requests, they have not made it clear how this is actually going to happen. But certainly an airport expansion is not consistent with that plan. So in fact, my union, which the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan is made up mainly of 4 unions, and my union is made of 83,000 of those 331,000 members. And we actually voted 2 years ago to divest from all fossil fuels. So this expansion is not consistent with that either. So I'm just here today from Canada to let you know that the North Somerset Council and people of Southwest England, that you're not alone in asking the managers of my pension fund to abandon this project that would expand the use of fossil fuels. It's certainly morally egregious and it's financially risky. So I just thank you for your time today and wish you well.
Thank you, Ms. Burgess. Let me just see whether there's any questions.
So the only thing I would say at all is, I think back in February, I understand the pension fund did make a statement in relation to some of the people that have pensions with it, opposing the application. I don't know whether that's in front of the inquiry. It's a short statement. I'll try and get hold of it, and then you'll know what the pension fund thinks. But as Burgess has said, there are about 1/3 pension fund members, of which I understand there are a number. I think the number was 600 that was mentioned that are opposed. But I'll try and get the statement for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, and I'll just clarify, those are the people who are being formally represented today, but 1/3 of those members did vote to divest from fossil fuels, and certainly this project is not consistent with that.
Okay, thank you. That's understood. Ms. Burgess, if you haven't done so already, will you email a copy of your speaking notes to Joanna Vincent? I'm assuming you've got her contact details.
Yes, I certainly will. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else? I've got a Joe Tristan. Oh, Mr. Tristan, yes. Is Mr. Tristan with us? We tried to get him earlier. No? Do we have anybody else that's... No. Oh, all right then. Any other matters before we close? Any matters? Any matters from the parties before we close then? No. All right. In that case, we'll adjourn the inquiry and we'll resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you, everybody.